So welcome again to the Key Biodiversity Area information session for IBA caretakers and volunteers. It'll be recorded, so keep that in mind if you'd like to turn on your video, just that you will appear in the recording later. For the moment, you'll be muted, your video is off, but at the end of the presentation, you'll be able to turn that on. Without any further ado, we'll pass it over to our first presenters, Amanda Beekle and Jeff Driscoll. And you should be able to share your screen, Jeff, or no, that'll be me. So Amanda, let me know when you'd like to start and we'll get going.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. I'm so glad I see lots of familiar names and lots of new names too. So looking forward to the discussion afterwards. I am Amanda Beekle. As Peter said, I work for Birds Canada as the Ontario Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas Coordinator, but have been doing a lot of national work in the last few years as well for the IBA to KBA transition that we've been talking about so much. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. I'm not sure if Jeff, you wanted to take this slide.
Yeah, I guess I can do that and also introduce myself now, maybe.
Sure.
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Jeff Driscoll and I am the KBA technician for Birds Canada. I'm really happy to be here today chatting with everyone about the crosswalk of IBAs to KBAs and to introduce a little bit more about KBAs as well. So the goal for today's session is just to start off by reviewing the foundation of IBAs, which Amanda will be doing shortly. Peter will be introducing the KBA initiative, who's involved, and then I'll be giving a bit more background on the IBA KBA transition or crosswalk as we term it, and introducing IBA and KBA case studies. I probably should have updated that slide, sorry, because there will be two. For the crosswalk itself, and really a big goal for us is to get everyone interested and excited about KBAs, and then like Peter said, we'll have a lot of time at the end for discussion about the IBA and KBA transition and hear from everyone.
Awesome. So I will start by talking about the IBA program. I think a lot of you on this call already know a lot of what I'm going to say, but for any new volunteers or anyone else watching for interest's sake, I'll start with kind of a broad description of the IBA program. So IBAs are a suite of sites designated for large groups of birds or species at risk here in Canada. And our main goals are to identify those sites, monitor them for population trends, and conserve them when it's appropriate and or possible. These sites are mainly coastal sites or interior wetland sites with a few inland forests of importance for species at risk that breed there. There are more than 13,000 IBAs globally in almost every country, and there's been almost 40 years of work for the global IBA program. Canada's 582 sites are shown on the map here, and I guess all of this is to highlight that what we're going to be talking about later, the foundation of the KBA program is really rooted in the IBAs that have been around for a long time. And around 75% of the world's KBAs that are identified to date are, in fact, IBAs that have been kind of carted over to the KBA program, which is more all-encompassing, and we'll hear a lot more about that later. So next slide, please. So I'll just talk a little bit, I won't go too deep into the criteria, but in Canada we use two criteria, species at risk and aggregations of species. And there are two other IBA criteria, which are range and biome restricted species that we just never were able to apply to any of the species in Canada. So we just use those first two. But as you'll see, there are more KBA criteria. You'll see that later. So next slide. So who's involved? There's national leads in Canada, and that's Birds Canada and Nature Canada, and we're BirdLife partners, BirdLife International, global partners for the Canadian IBA program. And we basically deal with technical and logistical parts of the IBA program. But it's really the regional partners help that implements the program on the ground. A few of the provincial IBA coordinators that are here today are from Birds Canada, like me for Ontario, and the rest are from nature organizations for the province, like Nature NB, Nature New Brunswick, for example. And they're responsible for organizing local conservation efforts, advocacy, monitoring, and planning, relaying information back to the national partners, recruiting and coordinating caretakers, and supplying caretakers and volunteers with resources and advice when needed. And then there are the caretakers themselves, and really we couldn't do much without the caretakers and volunteers. There are local eyes and ears, so to speak. Some caretaker responsibilities are to visit and monitor their IBAs when trigger species are present, organize and carry out conservation activities, report back to the IBA coordinator, and share stories and experiences with others. And this kind of, their responsibilities change on a case by case basis. For example, some IBAs could benefit from added protection, whereas it's not even possible for some. So those might benefit more from outreach and education or monitoring. It changes on depending on which IBA you are talking about. So next slide, please. So this map just shows quickly the distribution of approximately 300 sites in Canada with caretakers at them across Canada. And the highest caretaker coverage occurs in BC because they piloted the caretaker program years ago. So they were the first to roll with it and are doing really, really well with the caretaker program. And next slide. So some program successes that we've had are the many resources that we have for caretakers and volunteers on our website, which we've maintained for, I don't know how many years, sorry. And some of the resources that are up there include site summaries that you can read, data, bird data, caretaker maps, and caretaker resources like the IBA protocol and the manual. So far, we also have around 300 sites, like you saw on the map, that have caretakers assigned to them. Plus, eBird makes it so that around 67% of the IBAs are adequately monitored by 6,200 people. So sometimes people are contributing to the program without even knowing it by submitting eBird checklists, which is really great. There have been some successful conservation projects, the most recent of which was around the Prince Edward County South Shore IBA and getting a conservation reserve proposed and accepted. They're in the review process right now as part of the local South Shore Joint Initiative, and that's all around the context of the IBA. So there's been some conservation successes like that as well. We've had specific funding that we've helped distribute for caretaker engagement at priority IBAs. That was called the Local Action Fund. And we've had some successes with a few policies based around IBAs, such as our Birds Canada wind energy policy, which recommends no wind turbines be placed in IBAs, things like that. Next, please. And so throughout the history of the program, we've always kind of known that IBAs are important for more than just birds. We did an analysis a few years ago that indicated that 58% of federally listed vascular plants overlap with IBAs, as do 70% of amphibians and reptiles, and the list goes on. So we know it's not a secret. We know that IBAs are important for a lot of other species as well. And this is kind of the segue into the KBA program. So KBAs represent such a natural evolution of the IBA concept. And I guess I will just hand it over to Peter to dive more into the KBA program and tell us more about that.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, so I'll pick up right where Amanda left off with just a quick introduction to the KBAs and the work that WCS Canada is doing to identify new species KBAs. And so key biodiversity areas have a very specific definition, which is that they're sites that contribute to the persistence of biodiversity. It's really similar to the IBAs, like Amanda mentioned, but the power of key biodiversity areas and the value is that they incorporate all elements of biodiversity, from birds to fungi to trees to bumblebees and bears. And so it's really exciting, and the purpose of the KBAs and that tool is to be able to synthesize and incorporate a lot of different tools into a single one. Previously, there were a lot of different ways to identify important sites for nature or important biodiversity areas. We had the IBA programs, which were global and of course across Canada as well. There were important plant areas, there were Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. And so there were dozens of different tools at the international scale and the national scale and then subnational scales across the world to identify different elements of biodiversity and sites important for biodiversity. The KBAs synthesized a lot of those into one. It doesn't capture everything. It doesn't capture biocultural values, for example, or indigenous values to land. But the KBAs are able to combine a lot of those tools into a single one to create one tool, one way of identifying key biodiversity areas that is quantitative, objective, rigorous, and standardized across countries and jurisdictions. And so it does have that very specific definition. Like Amanda mentioned, there are a couple of different criteria that we use to identify these important or key biodiversity areas. And so we can identify them for most commonly threatened biodiversity and geographically restricted or rare biodiversity. So for example, threatened sage grouse, a site important for threatened sage grouse might be a key biodiversity area, like many of the IBAs already, or sites with rare species, like the Vancouver Island marmot, might indicate a key biodiversity area or trigger a key biodiversity area. That biodiversity also includes ecosystems as well. And so threatened and rare ecosystems like alvars can also be identified as key biodiversity areas. And that speaks to some of the power of being able to combine species and ecosystems into one tool with the key biodiversity area program. Sites can also be recognized as key biodiversity areas if they're important for biological processes like migration of birds, but also migration of other animals like caribou. And also sites that are important for other biological processes like bat hibernacula or snake hibernacula. These are also really cool biodiversity elements that can now be captured by the key biodiversity area program. And finally, KBAs can also be identified for much larger sites as well, sites that are important for either irreplaceability in a really quantitative context or ecological integrity as well. And these ecological integrity criteria and C sites are something we're really excited to identify across Canada because, of course, Canada is one of the countries with some of the largest tracts of wilderness and intact landscapes. And so we expect that Canada will be one of the few countries to have a lot of huge ecological integrity key biodiversity areas where the sites are important for the persistence of really large ecosystems and landscapes because of their ecological integrity. So we use, to identify these specific criteria, we use an international and a national standard. The global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas was published in 2016, following years and years of conversations led by the IUCN and working groups that involved a lot of international NGOs, including BirdLife International, to develop this standard. And so the result, that global standard, is a single method for identifying key biodiversity areas that outlines every step of the process, from what information can be used inside of them, to what criteria we use to identify them, to who needs to be alerted and what the potential uses are, although there are many, many uses. But this global standard is really neat because it means that the same way that we identify key biodiversity areas in Canada is the same method, same process that is used in South Africa or Mozambique or other countries around the world. And that's really helpful, as I'll touch on later on. In 2019, the Key Biodiversity Area Program was brought to Canada, although there were a lot of Canadians involved in the global identification in the global standard. But in 2019, the program was brought to Canada, and we adapted the global standard to the Canadian context. And so in Canada now, we can identify key biodiversity areas that are globally significant and also nationally significant. This is a really collaborative effort. I talked a little bit about that global KBA program. And so there's a global secretariat which develops the global standard and it's updating that. There's a world database of key biodiversity areas, similar to the world database of IBAs. In Canada, there's a huge group around this as well. So the leaders of the work are Birds Canada, Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, and NatureServe Canada. Birds Canada is leading the work of reassessing all of the IBAs to the KBA standard. WCS Canada is identifying new key biodiversity areas for species and ecosystems. And NatureServe Canada is playing an incredible role in terms of the data management and making sure we have the information and the data to be able to go through these really quantitative and rigorous processes. But it's not just these three organizations. There's a huge network of others. The KBA Canada Coalition is a loose group of government and NGOs and Indigenous organizations and communities that are surrounding the KBA effort. And all of them are helping contribute to the development of these tools and eventually the use of this information as well. And there's an even larger community around the KBAs already, which is even more representatives of government, experts, knowledge holders, academic partners, and potential users of information as well. And so there's a huge network, and I'll speak a little bit more to this process as well in just a moment. Just to quickly mention, some of the value of the key biodiversity areas, because they synthesize so many different elements of biodiversity, they're really well able to slide into conservation strategic plans at national and conservation and national levels. And so, for example, at the national level, KBAs are used to help set conservation targets and measure progress towards conservation targets. At the national level as well, the Canada Pathway to Target 1 Steering Committee recognizes KBAs as one of the qualitative elements that we should consider as Canada reaches its goals to protecting certain amounts of land and waters. And so as we move towards protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, KBAs will be one of the tools that we consider, one of the layers of information that we consider about what places we should protect. And so that's really interesting, and again, it happens because KBAs are able to incorporate so many different elements of biodiversity, and because they're such a standardized tool across different regions and countries. I won't step into all of this information because I'd like to leave a lot of time for the rest of the presentations and for questions at the end. But there's a couple cool facts about KBAs that make them useful tools for conservation. I will talk quickly about the work that we're doing to identify new key biodiversity areas. As I mentioned, WCS Canada is leading that work to identify KBAs for new species or for other species than birds and for ecosystems. And to do this, we use a really regional approach. And so for the species KBAs especially, we have coordinators across all regions and territories, provinces and territories that themselves rely on huge networks of local experts. And so all of this work really relies on the networks of and the local conservation landscapes where these KBAs are being identified. It's not just at the national level looking down and seeing, drawing circles on the map. It's really coming from people in these areas and experts in these areas that know the landscape and the species and sites best. And so that's really cool and exciting. It's also, as a result of that, a really participatory process. And so we're trying our best to involve as many experts as possible into the identification of KBAs, but also to involve different stakeholders and rights holders and Indigenous peoples. And that's something that we think is really important and really adds to not only the scientific value of these KBAs, but also to the value of how they'll be used in conservation. If we can get more people excited about them, more people involved in helping create them, then they'll be more useful tools overall. And of course, the IBA caretakers and coordinators are a huge interest group that we're hoping to involve and get excited about these tools as well. For species, I just wanted to show a quick map of so far some of the sites that we've identified. All of these dots are places where we think we're pretty sure will be KBAs. And so far we have about over 350 of these species KBAs that are being identified. These are either entirely new KBAs for things like, Massasauga rattlesnake or beach pinweed or, different plants and animals, or they could be biodiversity that is being added to existing KBAs. So some of these points on the map are places where we're already looking at IBAs and ideally working with caretakers as much as we can to identify new biodiversity elements to add to those previous IBAs, places like Prince Edward County, South Shore, Long Point, Pelee Island, and others. There are also larger ecosystem KBs, which I mentioned, and so we're still developing these tools and methods to map out these areas, but we already in the prairies are pretty far along with this. Our ecosystem coordinator, Dr. Lucy Poley, is leading this work at WCS Canada, and it's really exciting. You'll note the huge size of all of these areas. And that brings me to the last thing that I want to mention, which is just the principles that we're using as we identify new key biodiversity areas. As we're going about this, we're taking care to making sure that no data is lost about existing sites. So we're not trying to lose existing IBA boundaries, even if they're within larger KBAs. We're trying to keep those areas of importance for specific KBA species and birds. And likewise in the other way, as we identify new species within bird KBAs, if the area used by, for example, a small salamander is much smaller than the area used by the rest of the birds in that area, then we'll try to highlight areas of specific importance for those other species as well within the KBA. And we're always trying to respect the work that's gone on before. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel with KBAs. There's already such a huge history and work that's gone on with the IBAs and with the caretakers. And so we really want to build off of that and help complement the work that's been done before. And I think I've gone a little over time, but I just want to show quickly a map of all the areas. This includes IBAs and new sites that we're identifying. So we're doing a lot of work to identify all the cool nature areas across the country, and it's really exciting. I think it is, and hopefully you will too. So I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda and Jeff, and we'll look forward to answering questions later. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, Peter, are you going to control slides or am I? Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. There is everyone seeing my slides? Just to double check. Okay,
looks good.
Good. Perfect. Let me know if anything lags or anything, because just before this, we did run into a bit of an internet connection on an issue on my end. So hopefully this doesn't happen, but yes. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and dive more into Birds Canada's focus for the KBA program, which is kind of involving the reassessment of Canada's IBAs with the new KBA criteria. And this we've kind of termed or coined the crosswalk. So the crosswalk was an analysis that we did to determine which IBAs in Canada will be candidate or presumptive KBAs. And kind of why are we doing this crosswalk? Well, as we heard from Amanda previously, the IBA program has been around for more than 20 years. There are many established sites using scientific benchmarks and a lot of really great ongoing work at many IBAs involving conservation action and monitoring and things like that. So it was a really natural foundation for the identification of many KBAs in Canada, and a really obvious starting point for the program. And also, like Amanda said, we've also already done a lot of work on what biodiversity exists in IBAs, so we know that most IBAs hold more diversity than just birds there as well. So before diving into, I guess, the exact process of how we went about crosswalking our IBA program to the KBA program, I'd like to highlight first that Canada is really one of the first countries to do this work on kind of a national level. So there wasn't really an already established process we could use to guide our work. So we relied on our really fantastic and resourceful landscape science and conservation team at Birds Canada, and especially our really amazing data guru, Dean Evans. And the first step in this process was to first compile bird data that had been collected in IBAs and submitted to Nature Counts, which is Birds Canada's central database. Many of you are likely familiar with Nature Counts, but if not, I'm just going to briefly mention that it's a really great online data portal and resource that brings together observation data on birds and other biodiversity from all of our Birds Canada programs. So examples could be like eBird, Christmas bird count, breeding bird atlases, IBA data, and so much more. This resulted in a lot of data for our crosswalk, like over 17 million records, which is wild to read and see. It's crazy how much data went into this. We also updated population estimates for bird species across Canada using information from BirdLife International, Partners in Flight, and CSIWIC as well. When we then compared the data to the new and updated criteria for KBAs to see which IBAs and bird species at them could meet standards for KBAs, both globally and nationally. And for this crosswalk, we specifically, like Amanda mentioned with the previous IBA assessment, focused on species at risk criteria and aggregation criteria. So to date, our assessment found that approximately 50,000 records from the 582 IBAs currently in Canada met KBA thresholds, which is represented on this really fantastic map we have on screen here. On the map, you can see that the testing resulted in 277 IBAs having globally significant species triggers or species that met thresholds. Globally, and these are kind of the reddish filled in polygons on screen. And then there was also another 172 nationally significant thresholds that were met for IBAs, and these are the polygons that are kind of like I'm going to call it a goldish fill. And the remaining 133 IBAs in Canada are kind of shaded in a gray fill for their polygons, and these are sites that did not contain data currently that meets KBA thresholds. So out of these presumptive global and national KBAs, there are about 257 sites that are data deficient, which hopefully, if my graphic works here, yep, you can see on screen. So these are all highlighted in blue. And basically, these are data deficient sites. And this could be due to infrequent monitoring or the remoteness of the site, making it potentially not easily accessible for monitoring. And there are a couple reasons why data might be considered data deficient. So this kind of centers around specifically the data's age and its repeatability. So kind of just to elaborate on that a little bit more. So data age specifically within our standards it's preferred that we use to determine KBA status that data should not be collected any longer than 8 to 12 years before the assessment. And data collected before this period, I will say, can still be used to determine KBA status. However, it does require consultation with local experts to really confirm that the site is still important for that species in question, specifically just to make sure that the population and habitat at that site hasn't really changed significantly since the last survey records or observations. And then with respect to data repeatability, this is basically focusing on for species to successfully meet KBA threshold, it must regularly or predictably be observed at a given site, where there should be no fewer than 3 seasons of adequate data. And so this basically just means, for example, if a species is only observed during spring migration at a site, for example, you would need to observe that species for three years during the spring season for that to qualify as KBA assessment data. And just before I move on from this slide, I did want to highlight that the map on screen, even though right now it's just screenshots, is really an amazing interactive tool that our team created to help with the crosswalk of IBAs to KBAs. And it has a lot of really great features, like I previously just showed, being able to highlight which sites are data deficient. You can click on a site, which hopefully this graphic works, yep, and bring up like a table that summarizes specific species that met thresholds at that site, the number, when that data was recorded, the season, which criteria it met at global and national levels, and also pinpoint which are data deficient. So for example, on the Queen Maud Gulf example on screen, you can see Brant on the first line was both out of date and only had a single observation or 1 year of data, so in the summer. And it's just a really fantastic tool to have to support caretakers and experts going through this review process. There's also a review site button on screen that will bring up a Google form that will help guide you when you're going through reviewing a site on specific questions for assessing our crosswalk assessment and filling any gaps. And in the corner of the screen as well, I don't know if my mouse shows up on screen, but there's a See KBA thresholds button as well. And this brings up a really great searchable table that you can kind of just explore to see what the exact thresholds are for birds across Canada, the population data we use, the current species status as well. So this is just a really great tool to support the IBA KBA crosswalk. If anyone is interested after this talk, we're more than happy to share this with them to help support that assessment, and of course also meet with them one-on-one as well, just to chat about it a little bit more too. So what are we working on now? So currently, we are undertaking a provincial review to fill in data gaps for the KBAs that have been identified. So this includes looking for newer data available, missing species, and potentially missing sites as well. So combining suggestions for new KBA sites. This review has involved reaching out to experts to distribute our initial results, which we're doing today. The web map that I just previously chatted about, sharing up-to-date bird data as well, circulating that Google form where we ask questions that address about whether or not the crosswalk is complete for a site, if there's data missing, whether or not the boundaries are still correct, and suggestions for others to reach out to for that IBA or region. And this is really important for those data deficient sites, which we're really making a priority right now to look at, that you kind of saw on the previous map highlighted in blue. And many of you on this call may have bird expertise across Canada with specific sites. So I cannot emphasize it enough. It would be really great to get your input in this and for you to be involved in the program if you have interest in it. And like Peter mentioned as well, we're also working with the WCS team on addressing situations like integrating non-bird data, so other taxa into existing sites, but also we're looking at with new KBAs and existing IBAs that are qualifying for KBA, looking at how those overlaps with boundaries might be addressed. So determining whether they might need to be merged or separated. And we've been finding that it's a different case for each site, so it's really case by case. And we're developing a procedure to follow as we kind of go through more cases. And I will say that that's likely to potentially happen more often as new KBAs are proposed. But I do want to really, I guess, emphasize that in any case, when something like this is happening with an overlap, we will not make changes to an IBA boundary without reaching out to caretakers and local experts for their feedback on that process. So you will be kept in the loop and actively involved. And I guess before we also, Peter or Amanda, let me know if I'm going to overtime and I can speed up. But before we wrap up and open up the floor for discussion and kind of going through the questions some of you may have submitted beforehand, Amanda, Peter, and I thought it might be helpful to go over 2 case studies of what the process is like for adjusting an IBA boundary and integrating non-bird data to a site as well. So the first site I'll be focusing on is a KBA in New Brunswick. Called the Scumanak Beaches, located on the eastern coast. This works, there we go, of New Brunswick between Miramichi and I hope I don't butcher this pronunciation, especially because I'm from New Brunswick, but Kushabuguak National Park. And this site was originally designated as an IBA for supporting a nationally significant portion of Atlantic Canada's breeding piping plover population. Throughout the 1990s to 2000, 2 to 4 piping plover pairs were observed breeding on these beaches, and an average of 5 individuals observed, which at the time represents about 1% of the Canadian Atlantic coast population. After we completed our initial crosswalk assessment of our IBAs, Scumanak Beaches unfortunately lacked significant or sufficient data, to trigger KBA status, which you can see on the image in the right-hand corner there. It's shaded gray, like on the larger map that we showed earlier, indicating it's still just an IBA, or at least at the time it was. And this was largely due to the piping plover data being only from 1993 to 2000, making it out of date. So to address this data deficiency, we reached out to the local IBA caretaker, the New Brunswick IBA coordinator, and a Birds Canada species expert for piping plovers to kind of go through this provincial review process for this site. To fill in gaps. And during our meeting, we asked about some of the things I touched on previously, whether or not the current IBA boundary still made sense for the species, if there were additional bird data or non-bird data to include, and other contexts we should also reach out to. And so during these meetings, we were provided with a fantastic update of piping plover breeding pair data for along the original stretch of the beach, that was within the then current IBA boundary and outside of the boundaries along the northern shore, nearby shoreline, This new data also revealed that significant piping plover nesting sites were actually outside of the current IBA boundary. So this indicated to us that we needed to refine the boundaries to better reflect the area that piping plovers were actively depending on. So you can see in the right-hand corner, the map changed a little bit. So we refined the boundaries to include kind of the eastern portion of the original boundary, but then also it extends now down to the down south up until Point Sibbon Harbor, which is all continuous beach habitat being used for piping plover. Not only did this data help us refine the boundaries of the site to be more accurate, but it also triggered KBA designation for piping plover at the national level for A1A, which basically requires for threatened species observations to need to be greater than 0.5% of their national population size and include greater or more than 5 reproductive units, which just means basically 5 breeding pairs for that species, so 10 individuals that are breeding pairs. And for piping plover, you can see in the kind of reddish text that was 5.165 individuals and 5 reproductive units for that species. And this is just a really great successful story of how integrating data can help boost that IBA status to KBA designation and make sure that the boundaries are more reflective of the species that are using that site. Before moving on to the next case study, I did just want to kind of put in a disclaimer of sorts that while in this case we did refine the boundaries of the original IBA, this won't be the case necessarily for every IBA we review with experts. It's going to vary case by case and will require sufficient data and expert feedback to really justify that boundary refinement to be more accurate to the bird species or other species using that IBA or KBA. And then the final case study we're going to go over is for Misko Island, which will highlight basically this review process and how it can integrate non-bird data into KBA. Before jumping in this, I just want to say that we are focusing on another New Brunswick site, but I just want to say that this is largely due to we had really fantastic coordinators and do have fantastic coordinators working in Atlantic Canada that really were able to devote a lot of capacity to this transition, resulting in a large number of sites going through this review process. And so there are really good examples for us to pull from. And also no bias on my part that I'm a maritimer. But so Misko Island KBA is located off the tip of the northeastern New Brunswick, right here, between Bay de Chaleur to the west and Gulf of St. Lawrence to the east. And it was originally designated as an IBA for continentally significant congregatory species. And this included common tern, northern gannet, razorbill, and surf scotter. And nationally significant for threatened species, piping plover again, actually. And upon reassessment with our crosswalk, the site actually qualified as a national KBA for piping plover and northern gannet. And then other species did trigger global status, but were data deficient, unfortunately, currently. And you will see on screen here that piping plover had the same designation as the previous case study that we went over. But with northern gannet, on the other hand, it's designated nationally for D1A, which basically means observations for that species need to exceed a set threshold of 1% or more of its continental population size for the species aggregation. And right now, you might be asking yourself, what's the next step, I guess, for an IBA that passed our initial crosswalk and was not deemed data deficient for bird trigger species? So as Peter kind of touched on earlier, another key component is the integration of non-bird data in IBAs. And that is kind of like the next natural step for this site. And so in the case of Misko Island, the WCS Canada team identified that the site was significant for Gulf of St. Lawrence aster, which is a species at-risk plant that is endemic to the southern shores of Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada, which you can see a really nice picture of it on screen in the left corner there. And you can see on the map in the right-hand corner that initially an area was delineated in red on Misko Island that was encompassing where the species occurs on the island within the larger IBA boundary based on currently available data. Once this first assessment was conducted, the WCS team reached out to our Birds Canada team to notify us that non-bird data will need to be added to the IBA. Our team's kind of next step was to reach out to the caretaker of the IBA and local experts to confirm that the existing IBA boundaries are still appropriate, and in this case they were, and will be used as the final boundary for the KBA. But in other cases, again, this could require refining and would require further additional discussions with caretakers and experts. And finally, this new non-bird data will be integrated and incorporated into updated site description. And once our website is released as well, we'll be on the site page for that, and a really great map tool that will be available for people to look at. And upon kind of pending review from local plant experts, I suppose in this case for Gulf of St. Lawrence aster, the kind of internal red polygon that you see on screen may be available as kind of a toggle on off layer as well, just so you can see specifically the area of concern for that species and maybe help, for example, management of the sites, in that case for Gulf of St. Lawrence aster. And that kind of wraps up the case studies we had and concludes, I guess, the presentation portion of today's session. I guess just on behalf of our team and colleagues, I just want to thank everyone for attending today. And again, if you have any questions after today's session, please feel free to reach out to Amanda, myself, or Peter. Our contact information is on screen here. And if you're interested in reviewing any of the existing IBAs for gaps in the crosswalk assessment, please reach out, and we're more than happy to share that really great map tool I put up earlier and support you going through that process. And I think now I'm handing it over to Peter to start the opening up the floor for questions. And yeah, get a conversation rolling with everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to allow everyone to turn on their mics and turn on your camera if you'd like. No pressure to do either, but yeah, if you have any questions, please use the raise hand function or just unmute yourself and chime in. You can also drop questions in the chat still, and we'll get to those. Maybe we'll break the ice by, well, if anyone has a question, maybe just jump in right now. Otherwise, we'll break the ice with a question in the chat.
How will sites be informed of the result? Or how and when?
Yeah, great question. So it will depend. So let me tackle that from the WCS Canada side, and then Birds Canada can chime in after. So if we identify, for example, a new biodiversity element within an existing IBA that will be a KBA, or if we're identifying a new KBA in a region just nearby an IBA, one of the steps that we do for every new KBA that we identify is a review period. And so we review the site with technical experts who look at species information and make sure that's correct. But we also do a stakeholder and a rights holder outreach review as well. And so this is a more general stage, but we try to pass it by any naturalist groups that might be interested, definitely any caretakers that are nearby or at the site that might be interested, and also, you know, local communities and other groups that just, you know, should probably know about the site. And so we have a really broad definition of that, but that's where we try to get the biggest news out at that site scale for different KBAs that we're identifying. Anything to add on to that, Amanda or Jeff?
I'm not sure that I caught the question fully.
It
Sorry.
was, it was about how the folks will be notified.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess the website is a big thing as well. Once sites are confirmed, they'll be put up on the new website once that's all ready to go. And just like Peter said, we'll be reaching out to all the caretakers, or we already have, and coordinators, and in cases where we need to ask about the boundary and data, we'll be trying to contact as many people as we can and as many organizations and individuals as we can to make sure that everything is still appropriate and makes sense. So yeah, similar procedure. Does that answer your question? Is that Dave?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. I see Thais has their hand up. I'm just going to tackle two questions in the chat, which are pretty similar. Will the IBAs disappear and be replaced by KBAs, or will both now exist? And then related, what happens if the IBA site does not meet the criteria of KBA?
Okay, I guess I'll take those. Yeah, thanks for your questions. Didn't really go over that, so you didn't miss that in the presentation. But so BirdLife International is still maintaining a database of IBAs, and actually The criteria is still being updated, and that information is being kept as current as possible as well. So it's a slightly different criteria, so they're keeping that. So IBAs aren't just going to disappear or be replaced, but if an IBA does qualify to become a KBA, it will be on the KBA database as well. So it'll kind of be in two places at once, with the greater kind of knowledge being in the KBA database, because we'll be adding all that other really valuable data to it. So nothing will disappear, like Peter said. And what happens to the IBA sites that do not meet the criteria? Yeah, so there's a few different categories, like Jeff was talking about. There's the data deficient ones. So for those ones, we're working really hard to reach out to people to try to get a hold of new data that's not in nature counts, which is what we used for the analysis. So those we're kind of still working on. And then the sites that we do find that have no data, that qualifies for becoming an IBA or a KBA. I mean, there's not a lot of those that don't qualify for anything, especially for conservation actions that are going on at them. But for those will be on the IBA website as IBAs, and then the ones that become KBAs will be on the KBA website and the IBA website, if that kind of answers the question.
Thank you.
I hope I answered that.
I think that was good. Yeah, chime in the chat if you have a follow-up. Thijs, I saw you put your hand down, so I'll assume that your question is answered, but raise it again if you have anything else.
Yeah, sure.
James, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. So I'm interested in this idea of data lake, and I'm wondering ways you guys try and combat that and mitigate the damage that could be done, because there's a data lag, but there's still a lot of ecological processes going on. So do you kind of work between the KBA and IBA to see how you can identify ways to protect that area before you get the data? Do you look at policies like Species at Risk Act? What are ways you try and just mitigate that period of time where you don't have the data, but you have a hunch as an ecologist that no, there's something going on here and we need to be proactive and try and combat that even if we don't have the data?
That's a really, really great question. Can I try to answer that a little bit first? Because right now, our heads are in this like identification mode. So it's hard to think about that sometimes, but I think that's where the caretaker groups and the communities and organizations that we're reaching out to who have that local knowledge really come in, because the communication with them is so valuable that if something were to happen like that, they would see it first before we get that data or whatever. So I think that's where those communities come in, are really valuable. Local knowledge comes in handy. Yeah, so I would think that, and it's a case by case basis. So some sites that won't be an issue. They're already protected and they're already doing great, and they already have events and caretakers and monitors, and it won't be an issue. But yes, for some sites, hopefully there's a local voice that would get a hold of us, and we could work with them to do what needs to be done at the site, I guess.
Yeah, I would really add to that on our side as well. That's something we encounter a lot, because birds are the most well-studied animals, and they're not super well-studied, a lot of them, but they're a lot more studied than beetles and other weird flies and other things that we're still identifying KBAs for too. So that's something we encounter a lot. And yeah, it's really experts, local knowledge holders who know the sites well, who know the species well. We place a lot of weight on those expert inputs and knowledge, and that's really important for undersampled species and areas as well. And another value of the KBA process when we're starting from scratch like this is that we were able to outline those gaps. And so there are a lot of places where we have hunches that they should be. There are sites that are listed in COSIRA reports, but there aren't enough numbers or evidence or data to identify. But as we go through, we can build these lists of places that we need to go and we need more information at. So yeah, I would
Great
just say-
question.
Thank you. If there's anything else, please, yeah, feel free to type it in the chat, raise your hand. I'll just speak to an older question just for those who are on the video, who are watching the recording later. One of the earlier questions was about the Canadian Herpetological Society has important amphibian and reptile areas in Canada. And the asker was wondering if these have been considered for inclusion into KBAs. And yes, these important amphibian and reptile areas in Canada are AMPARA sites. Like I mentioned, we're trying to, that's another one of these designations like IBAs or important plant areas that we hope to build off of. And so in Ontario, especially our regional coordinator in Ontario has been working with Joe Crowley and others, other herpetological experts to check, look at these AMPARA sites and see which ones will meet criteria for KBAs, where we need more information, and to build off that process. So great question there.
I'll just mention that also I put the, sorry, totally different, but I put the map link that Jeff showed in the chat. So if anyone missed it, go back and spend some time looking at it if you'd like. And then we have another question here from Carol. So if a site is determined to be an IB and a KBA site, will there be multiple sites or forms that the coordinator or caretaker needs to provide data? Currently, the caretaker is just filling out one form and inputting data in eBird. So this is a good question and one that I get a lot in many forms, but I guess it could be seen in two ways. So no, it won't double your work just because it's an IBA and a KBA. Definitely not. But it kind of brings up a point that we're adding all these other species to the list of a lot of IBAs to become KBAs. Obviously, that's why the program is so important. So I guess I'll just answer this now because we'll probably get this question. That doesn't mean that you as a birder need to go out and survey for the beetle that we also found at the site. You're encouraged to do so if you would like. And if you know an expert on beetles who is keen to do that, that would be great also. But yeah, we're not adding these species just to increase the caretaker's workload. If you're only comfortable with doing birds and you want to keep doing birds, that's awesome. And so it doesn't change that caretaker program at all. Yeah, I think that's, do you have anything to add there, Peter?
I would just add as well, just to follow up on your last point. One of the things we're really excited about is now being able to include other naturalist groups as well into some of these sites, to kind of, more voices at the table to, to speak to these areas and the importance of them can only help in terms of protection and conservation. So we're excited to bring in other groups for plants and mammals and other interested folks. And we do have a great series of webinars for last month and then just before in 2021, if you're interested in kind of how KBAs might be able to be used to increase conservation engagement, both in IBAs and then with other naturalist groups too. I'd recommend checking out our website to look at those.
And a lot of our caretakers are already part of those bigger naturalist groups. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the individual has to go out and do more, but someone in their nature club might be keen to do it. So Amanda Shave has had her hand up for a while. Do you want to ask a question, Amanda?
I do. And actually, one of my questions was the caretaker question, which you just answered. So that timing was great. The other question I have is, it seems like the process is rolling out at different speeds at different provinces. So when this transition to KBAs happens, is it going to sort of officially happen across Canada, or is the plan to sort of do it province by province or like ecosystem by ecosystem or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I can tackle this one first. Yeah, as we're identifying new KBAs, one of our big limitations has been capacity. We never started with a bigger team. And so we've always, since we started in 2019, we've been doing it in a really patchwork way where we can get funding in one province, we'll start looking at KBAs and identifying new biodiversity in those places. And so it has been a really patchwork and very regional approach. And this is helpful in one way because it really, it forces us in a sense to rely on experts in the area and build off of existing things. But it also means that it's not everything is moving at the same time. It's a lot of different paces that things are going at. And so it is, even within regions as well, some areas and some groups of other species are advancing at different rates. That's really just the nature of the game, and we're trying to be flexible about it and in terms of communicating about it. Like Amanda said, the IBAs will always exist, and so it's not like there will ever be, a hard switch over. There will be kind of a point where we start focusing more on, or maybe we start talking more about the biodiversity as a whole, like when IBA started adding other biodiversity in their communications already. But yeah, it is a very patchwork approach, but yeah.
And I'll just add that as sites become confirmed, I think is the natural time when you can kind of start calling it a KBA, I guess, once that site is confirmed as a KBA and up on the website. Yeah, that's kind of what I see.
Yeah, there will be for each site kind of an official point where it goes through and it's confirmed at the national level, and then if necessary at the global level. And so that'll be the point where, there's officially a feather in the cap of that site, and it'll have that official recognition. Just going to some of the questions in the chat. There do not seem to be many Arctic KBAs. Is there a reason for that? I can tackle this one first again. A lot of it is, a lot of the reason is we don't have a lot of data. There are a fair amount of KBAs and even bird KBAs kind of on the coastlines, and we're identifying different sites for even plants and lichen far up north. In Yukon, there are a fair bit of sites, some for, collared lemmings, others for caribou. So part of it is that we're still kind of getting to these areas and they're still in progress. And the other thing is that as we look towards these broader ecosystem sites and sites for ecological integrity, that's where we'll really fill in the northern parts of Canada in terms of the map of KBAs, because there's a lot of intact landscapes up north that are really prime candidates for KBAs for those criteria, but not so many places up north that are really important sites for rare species or threatened species, at least that we have data for.
Great.
One more question from the chat before we move on to the raised hand. eBird has IBA subset available. Will iNaturalist be encouraged to do the same?
Great idea. Yes, there will be a really cool link in the new website when that gets released, a new link to iNaturalist and KBAs. So wait for that.
Yeah, we do pull out, when we're doing this work of identifying new KBAs, we do pull out all that data from iNaturalist as well. So any research grade observations are fed immediately into our process as well. So it's already kind of happening on one end of the process. And now, sorry, Anthony Gaston, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I was the guy that asked about the Arctic. I'm a bit concerned about the fact that there are a lot of very difficult to get to places in the Arctic, which probably have great value, certainly for birds anyway, which is my area. And I'm thinking of places that I went to in the 1980s, which were put down as IBAs, but there's no information since the 1980s. I mean, is there any kind of consideration given to the fact that these places are very difficult to get to, and also to the fact that it's very unlikely that anything's changed at these places because nobody goes there and there's nothing likely to have happened to them? I was just wondering, whether you might have a different approach to some of these very remote sites.
Yes, thank you. Great question. It is definitely something we have considered because of the way Canada is and how hard it is to get to some of the Arctic sites, but even some of the sites in Northern Ontario and Northern Alberta. are really hard to get to. So yes, there is, we are starting to and have reached out to experts to ask that very question, to make sure that we have the best knowledge that we can. If there's no actual data that we can get our hands on, sometimes there are, like sometimes CWS and some research papers have been really good resources to get us extra data in some of those Arctic sites. So we have actually been successful in some of those Arctic existing bird KBAs and found some good data there, more updated. But yes, for the sites that we can't get to, we are reaching out to experts to confirm that, one, exactly like you said, the habitat hasn't changed a lot, and so it's most likely, it's safe to assume that the habitat and the area that was originally designated as an IBA is still important for the same bird species. So yes, and in the nomination form, there is a place to expand on that and put the details there on, you know, the expert that was talked to and the justification for why it should still be considered a KBA, even though there aren't recent data. So yes, thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Another question from the chat from James. Given the changing climate and the shifting and moving of many species, have the KBA or IBA worked to identify and protect areas that are projected to become important as ways to be proactive rather than reactive? I can tackle this one first. Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And it's not something that's built in, well, it's built explicitly into the program in that all of the sites are reassessed after 8 to 12 years. And so we can only identify KBAs based on the data we have now. And there is a little bit of flexibility if, you know, we know sites haven't been visited in a while, but the habitat is the same, then we can use much older data than we would normally. But we can't base them off of where we think species will be. But what we can do is mark out these areas as high potential, and in 8 to 12 years or whenever we have more data, then we can identify those or reassess those areas. So that's how things like climate change are considered. But this highlights one of the ways that KBAs will need to have complementary tools as well. You know, they don't account for connectivity, indigenous values, and there's still a need for other tools for conservation as well. KBAs aren't the end all and be all, but they're a really helpful one that simplifies a lot of other things.
Thanks, Peter. That's good. So Stephanie, Steph says, is there a plan for coordinating KBAs after they have been identified? Will you be supporting a KBA caretaker program? So yes, this is something that for now won't change, but through time we will be integrating other, you know, monitoring methods and other things to do with other species into the plan. So yes.
Yeah, I think we'd love to do that, and definitely as we're in the identification stage as well, coordinating with naturalist groups is going to be even more critical, or is going to be super critical. But yeah, we're really hopeful to build on some of these monitoring programs for the future as well. Although at the moment we don't have, at least for other non-bird species, a huge amount of capacity to do that at the moment. Looking at the time, so it's 12:35. We'll be sticking around for another 25 minutes if there are questions, but if anyone has to go, feel free to log off and catch the last 25 minutes on the recording later if you'd like. But thanks everyone for coming. If you have to leave now, thank you very much for joining and for the excellent questions and discussion. And for those sticking around, please feel free to ask away still. James, go ahead.
Yeah, hope you don't mind me asking a second question. So yeah, my second question is about reactions at the local level from an economic perspective when you're establishing the KBAs. You know, if we think of an old growth forest, for instance, if you're trying to protect caribou or environmentally sensitive species, any kind of birds that are endemic to old growth areas, does the KBA just take precedence over a timber company trying to extract timber from that? What are the kind of like interactions happening there? What takes precedence?
Well, I guess, are you frozen, Peter? Or are you good?
I think he might be
Oh,
frozen.
he's frozen. Because I thought he
Am I
would take
frozen?
this one for sure.
Am I still frozen?
No, you're
Oh,
not. You're
no.
good.
Okay, sorry.
I was like waiting for you to answer. I guess I'll take it.
That's hilarious. Okay.
Well,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, sorry. That's funny. I had just said I was happy to take it, but I guess I was frozen while I said it. So,
Yes. You can go ahead.
yeah. So the KBAs are really just information. There's no management prescription or access to land implications that come with the identification of an area as a KBA. It's really just an information layer. And this is really good in some ways because, people who wouldn't really like to have conservation seen on their lands, like, ranchers or on private lands, don't mind the KBAs as much because there's no hard consequences with the identification. And with Indigenous communities as well, protection isn't always the immediate thing that they want to see happen. And so a flexible tool that's just information is something that's really helpful. But on the other hand, it means that if, for example, an old growth forest is identified as a KBA and there's already timber rights to that land or logging rights to that land, there's nothing immediate that the identification of the KBA will be able to do, but it's information that can be used to support, stopping those rights or adding protection to the site afterwards. But yeah, great question.
Yeah, ask as many as you want.
I guess I'll mention, I briefly touched on this in my presentation, but we also have an in-progress map of the non-bird KBAs that we're working on. So Amanda showed that really incredible interactive map by Dean, and Jeff did a little demo of that. Definitely recommend checking that out if you're interested in the bird side of things. If you're interested in the other side of things, you can check out this dashboard here that I just dropped in the chat. And this shows everywhere that we're looking at currently, kind of scoping out where we believe there's a high potential of having a non-bird KBA. And so eventually these dashboards will be integrated together and it'll be easy to see both all in one place. But for the moment, they live separately in these different dashboards. So feel free to check that out if you're interested. And if there are places that aren't on that map that you think should be, definitely reach out to either myself or anybody else on our team.
Great, good resource. There's another question. Maybe I missed this earlier, but what is the threshold for promotion from an IBA to a KBA? So there's many thresholds. So if we're just looking at the bird data, then it's actually not too different, but it just depends on the species. So it's either a species at risk and a percentage of their population, or a minimum reproductive unit, or if it's an aggregation of a species, then it's a minimum percentage as well. And we have a table that we've worked out for every bird species basically in Canada for that. But then also to be promoted to a KBA, adding other species, the great work that WCS is doing, also would promote it to a KBA. I like that term, promote it.
Yeah, and then we have, so I mentioned those 5 criteria. Sites can be identified for threatened species or rare species, or for biological processes like the aggregations for birds, or for ecological integrity or irreplaceability. And all of those criteria have more specific sub-criteria. And so for rare species, for example, any site that has 10% or more of the national or global population of a species at a site will meet criteria. And so for sites like for the Vancouver Island marmot, where it's only found in a couple of mountain ranges in Vancouver Island. Those are really great examples of clearly really endemic species, and the sites that that are identified for those are going to be, you know, obviously really important for the persistence of those species in there. And then there are other more specific criteria for threatened species. It ranges from 0.5 to 1% of the population of the species, and yeah, it goes on and with more specific thresholds.
And you can check out for more detail on those thresholds. You can check out the national standard for KBA criteria as well, or the global standard if you're interested.
Drop
It's
a link.
also available in French, I should say.
I'll drop a link to those there. So if you visit that
Nice.
link, you'll be able to see the global standard and then the national standard in both English and French.
Great questions, everyone.
Yeah, feel free to ask away. Great. There's one more question that had been sent beforehand that I think might be worth answering about the timeline of all of this. And so if you don't mind, Amanda, I'll softball that one over to you and then address it as well. But what's the timeline of when this is happening?
Or you're gonna pass that to me first, are you? Timeline. I guess it depends what you're talking about. The non-data deficient sites, we are hoping to have identified and kind of sent to the nomination committee at the global level and the national level in the next year. We'll be working on that. Data deficient sites, I mean, we're kind of continually working on them, and there'll be a spot for them on the website that will show that there's kind of still in progress. And then for the website, we are in the middle of development and design and text, and that will be available in the next year as well, let's say.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry.
What about you, Peter?
Yeah.
What's your timeline?
Yeah. So as well, like we mentioned earlier, it's going in a really patchwork way, and so you know, depending on what site, it will depend on you know when our coordinators have been able to start in that region and how quickly they've been able to progress. But definitely in the next year or two, we hope to have all of the KBAs in Canada identified for species and for ecosystems and for other sites, and so that's the end date. But of course, for the sites that matter most to you, it'll depend more on where you are in the list of the regions and our coordinators' priorities. But feel free, if you have questions, you know, for a given site or a given area, always feel free to reach out to myself or our other coordinators that are working, or of course Amanda and Jeff will be happy to be able to answer any of your questions about that as well. Another question in the chat from James. The KBAs and IBAs seem to be looking for expert input, but how can university students or recent graduates get involved with the work? That's a really great question. And definitely we're always looking for creative partnerships and others. So if you're interested, I'd say reach out and we'll try to find a way to fit you in. Certainly we've been able to make sure you can help participate in the process. We have had some great collaborations with research institutions, and so in Quebec, for example, the work that WCS Canada is doing to identify new sites is in partnership with Université de Sherbrooke. And so a research team there is doing an excellent job with identifying key biodiversity areas, and they've been able to identify students through, or been able to integrate students through courses and different classes, and also through different research projects. And so there's a huge potential for collaborating as a student or a graduate. But reach out and we'll do our best to find a way. And of course, anybody by submitting to iNaturalist or eBird is already helping us out quite a bit.
Yeah, totally agree. And if your work is, about birds specifically, and there's research projects that you think could contribute to, identifying IBAs as KBAs, we would be really appreciative of that.
Yeah, and that brings to mind as well, if you're interested in using the KBA products or the IBA products, reach out as well, because we're still in the identification stage now, but this will be an exciting research tool as well to see, what areas are most important for conservation by the standards of this tool. So yeah, a lot of avenues for collaboration and research potential. So please do reach out. Awesome. The questions seem to have slowed down a bit. If you have any others, please do raise your hand or type them in the chat. Otherwise, I think we might end a little early if there aren't any other questions. But any parting words, Amanda, Jeff?
No, just glad so many people showed up and asked such great questions. It was awesome. And yeah, always feel free to reach out if you think of any more questions after we hang up here.
Yeah,
Thanks everybody.
Yeah, same, echoing what Amanda and Peter are saying. It was really great to be here with everyone, and glad there were so many really awesome questions, and hopefully we get to continue the discussions after this too.
Super. I'm going to end the recording and